Hey, welcome to the Little Book Stories, which is essentially a 10-episode limited series of videos that I produce to expand on, sort of fill out some of the details of the stories that I share in my little book of Big Reasons to Love America. So each chapter is a reason, and each chapter has sort of this very eclectic mix of historical facts, principles, ideas, and stories from my own personal life. So I hope you enjoy it. This one is going to be dedicated to freedom. Here we go. Do you want to build a truly extraordinary life, what we call an exponential life? My weekly newsletter brings you insights, stories, expert conversations, my favorite books and podcasts every Sunday. Subscribers get exclusive access to my monthly group coaching webinars, all for free. And for the cost of a latte a month, you can help support our work and access our full archives. Subscribe at christianrayflores.com. All right, let's talk about freedom and why America has this climate where freedom is like breathing. It's just everywhere. It's so intoxicating and wonderful to me and to those of us who perhaps immigrated from places that are not free, that, the best way to explain it is that, freedom is like Wi-Fi. You don't notice it until you lose it, and then when you lose it, you really feel it. And I think most Americans should pay close attention to the liberties they enjoy and the nuance of that. There's a quote that really describes that tension that I think is everywhere, in every country, in every culture, by Benjamin Franklin. I actually learned it just recently. Those who would give up essential liberty to purchase a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety. And I think he's so right. I mean, he wrote it in 1755, and it sounds so relevant even today, is that, I think we're persuaded by the people that govern us sometimes to give up just a little bit of more of liberty so that they can provide a little bit more safety. And that is just the death trap, right? That's how tyranny starts. In America, there's this incredible climate of freedom-loving, liberty-loving people that have almost like this sixth sense, I call it, the antibodies against tyranny. But even in America, I think freedom is just one generation away from being lost, because it's so easy to slip into giving up a little bit of your freedom, a little bit of your liberty to acquire a little bit of more safety. And Benjamin Franklin says the people who do that don't deserve either of those things. So, Varieties of Democracy Institute states, shockingly, right? Every time I think about it, or even I speak that when I'm a guest on a podcast, it's hard for me to even wrap my mind around, is that 72% of the population of Earth live under an authoritarian regime. So it's 5.7 billion. Another 28% live under closed autocracy, sort of the extreme version of that. And only 13%, only 1 billion people live under liberal democracies. 13%, that's it. Those are the spectrum of freedom, right? Those are the people that live there. So freedom is, by definition, statistically, objectively, a rarity even today. Even though when you live in America, you feel like, yeah, everybody feels like that or lives like that, and it's just not true. So let's talk about what autocracy is specifically. And then I'll share some stories that I hope are going to be maybe enlightening, but also entertaining, right? So autocracy is basically this combination of centralized power. This one government has a centralized power. It suppresses dissent, right? So any dissenting opinions, voices, thoughts are suppressed actively. Controlled elections, where they're not fair, they're not transparent, and they're sort of obscured, right, muddy. There's restrictions to civil society, and there's complete or near complete control of media by the state. That's essentially what autocracy is. As I said, I grew up in 6 different countries. Some of them were unfree. The most unfree country was, of course, the Soviet Union. And I can give you just a few broad strokes of what was happening. And as an American, you might be unaware that that's how we lived, right? So, for example, I love music, right? And I was sort of in this privileged position where I can actually leave the country. You didn't have permission to leave the country until the States gives you permission to leave the country, to go especially to the West. And for most Soviet citizens, you would not get permission to go to the West. You can go to maybe allied countries in Eastern Europe, like Soviet bloc countries, but you didn't have permission to go to the West. Now, I was privileged because I had this double citizenship at the time. I had the Soviet citizenship and I had a Chilean passport. So they couldn't prevent me from going. So I would go to Berlin and then cross over, and I would get magazines and albums. It was just such a feast of the stuff we didn't have back in Russia. Now, in Russia, there was always a black market. So you can get your hands on a lot, right? Not everything, a lot. It was always, there was a lag, right? By the time it make it into the black market and you could buy it into these copies of cassettes, eventually CDs and things like that, there would be a lag. And I wanted the freshest, the newest stuff. So what I would do is I would have this short wave radio, and I would tune into Voice of America or BBC, and you have to do it in the middle of the night. It was actually illegal to tune into these stations. These stations were broadcasting essentially ideas of freedom and things from the West, things that are happening, onto the Soviet Union. And the Soviets actually had jamming stations to jam the signal. They were mostly unsuccessful, but the signal was just not very clear. So you have to do it in the middle of the night. I think the signal was more clear in the middle of the night. And then I would listen to these programs that were like musical top hits, right? The latest stuff. And the only place I could hear new music from the West was on Voice of America. And it was this sort of special quest for that. But imagine a world where you don't have access to the most basic things, like the newest music, right? That was the world we lived in. There's such control of the state that everybody who grew up in the Soviet Union had this fear of the state. It's like a baseline. It's just there. You can't really speak your mind in public. So people would speak their mind in little trusted circles, like in a kitchen over vodka in the middle of the night, and you would discuss dangerous ideas, and you wouldn't speak in public. It was just not culturally acceptable because it was dangerous. And there was still sort of this shadow. I was there in the mid-'80s when I came back. People still remembered the massive repressions under Stalin, which was 37 at the peak, where they would literally take you in the middle of the night, never to be seen again. And they would send people to the gulags. And they were at the peak, I think, about 10 million Soviet citizens in forced labor camps. And they were put there for dissenting, for saying something wrong. I mean, so many millions died just like that, without a trace. So that shadow, imagine that being done systematically, decades and decades. And there's, of course, many other crimes that were done by the Soviets in the Soviet Union. But this baseline fear was ever present. And for me, I came back from Africa. So I was this sort of jungle boy, essentially. My nickname was Mowgli, right? And I didn't get the memo. Right? Didn't get the memo that there's certain things you don't bring up in public. So I remember, in high school, I would be like, hey, so why are we invading Afghanistan? And it doesn't feel like the right thing to do. And people would there was this hush in the class, because even as a 16-year-old, you knew there were certain things you don't bring up, even in class. I mean, how scary and depressing is that? And then I remember one time I said, why did the Bolsheviks kill the whole family of Tsar Nicholas II? I mean, his wife, his children, his servants, they were basically marched into a basement. They were arrested, and then they were kept away, and then they were just shot and killed and buried somewhere in an unmarked grave. I mean, decades and decades later, they found the graves, but it just seems cruel to me. And I remember the hush again. So there's things that I didn't instinctively know, because I came from a place where there was not that many of those restrictions, right? It's these, we get used to lack of freedom, right? It's like, when you boil a frog slowly, it doesn't notice that it's dying. It's that kind of thing. Liberty can be lost by slowly increasing the heat and removing liberties and suppressing dissent and suppressing free speech, censoring and introducing identity politics and virtue signaling. All of those things were present in high contrast in the Soviet Union. So, eventually when we moved to the US, I was like, this is not good, and that's part of the reason why I wrote the book, is that those things are sort of showing up in American culture, and it just scares me and worries me. The term's even politically correct, right? PC. It's an American term everybody throws around, and what we don't know oftentimes is that term was coined by the Soviets, by the Russians. And politically correct was basically, there's one truth, one way of thinking about these things. And the one truth is the party line. Again, another term coined by the Soviets, the party line. The party says this, everybody fall in place, know your lane, this is how we think of this. There's another term that was even scarier. It was this term in Russian, politically reliable. So you were deemed politically reliable when you were politically correct and you were observed by people at home or by neighbors or in your workplace, and your political ideas aligned with the party line. So then you had more opportunities professionally, for example, because you're a politically reliable person for advancement, upward mobility, that sort of thing. But if you're not politically reliable, you can be brilliant and creative and wonderful. You basically didn't have a future in those systems, in those countries. And there's generations, millions of people who did not bring their creativity, their industriousness to their own nation because they were not politically reliable. The suppression of thought was just extraordinary. Just extraordinary. Even things like Hollywood movies, they wouldn't show them, first of all, in the movie theaters, right? So I think the Soviets had some strange alliance, sort of, at least in a very narrow way, with cinema, with Italy. We had Italian movies show up every once in a while in the movie theaters, and then France, for some reason. Every once in a while, eventually, American films start showing up, but it was sort of the safest one, right? The safest ones. But then, of course, technology evolved, and we had the VCR, right, which is the video cassette recorder that showed up. And of course, I was the proud owner of one of the first VCRs in my school. I think there was me and another boy who owned those, where the VHS tapes showed up. And there were no stores for movies. All you could get to get Hollywood movies, just like with music, is a copy of a copy of a copy. And sort of you can buy it in the black market, and the closest copy is to the first copy, to the original copy, the more expensive the tape is, right, to buy on the black market. So you would literally say, like, Rambo 2, first copy, ooh, that's more expensive. And then if it's a third, fourth copy, they wouldn't even mention it because it's probably going to be bad quality, but you still got it. You would buy things in the black market, or you would trade tapes with friends. And so if I had let's say a collection of 15 movies, which think about it, right? With Netflix, we have like thousands right now, or even before that, we had Blockbuster. You can go and get anything you want. But at the time, any sort of separate collection would be probably, 15 movies total, maybe 20. And that was a big collection. So if you have a collection and you have a collection, we would swap movies, right? So we don't have to buy new movies. We can just exchange them. So what we would do is we would meet somewhere in the metro, right? And we would say, hey, meet me at this station at this time, and I'll bring this and you'll bring that. And especially those movies that had maybe some reference to Russia as sort of the evil. Those are the evil people, usually, like Rambo had like these Soviet anti-heroes were Soviets. Those things could actually get you in. Those were forbidden things. Those things could get you in jail. So you would exchange those and you would wrap them in like newspaper, because you don't want anyone in the metro or the police or something to see the cover, what's written there, like Rambo or something else like that. So there were forbidden tapes. There were forbidden books that you couldn't find in any bookstore. There were many bookstores, and actually the bookstores in Russia had a lot of American classics, but they did not have things that were sort of not politically reliable, right? And especially they shut down some of the local writers, like Solzhenitsyn. Gulag Archipelago was a massive thing, right? Mikhail Bulgakov, Master and Margarita, and there's many more. And they suppressed those things. So you would find them in the black market, and they developed this thing called samizdat. Samizdat is basically self-published. Way before Amazon had self-publishing, the Soviets had self-publishing. And the way it looks like is that you would essentially copy the text of a book, of a forbidden book, on a typewriter using like 4 or 5 pages. This is before sort of Xerox technology was introduced, and then Xerox basically made that easier. But they would have, let's say, 5 pages through the carbon copy, pages in between, and you would make 5 copies of the book by literally doing it by hand. And they would bind it, and then they would sell it, exchange it. People would discuss these books in kitchens and little corners that were safe. But that was the level of suppression of truth, of censorship that we had at the time. And, what's scary thinking about those times is that it was so normal. We were not, we knew we didn't like it, but I think on average, people just made their peace with it. This is just the reality. And they were not protesting. They were not rebelling. They were just, adjusting to it. So I went to this college in Russia called Rudan, which is Russian Friendship University, or Friendship University, friendship between people, that kind of thing. And this college was essentially there to train experts, professionals from other allied countries. So either countries that were in the Eastern Bloc already, that were Marxist aligned, or people that were sort of in the opposition in the countries that the Soviet bloc was hoping to expand their reach eventually. So, and 50% of the students were Russian, 50% were foreign. And I was second generation alumni. My dad went to the same university, and that's how I got in. It was actually very hard to get in. And it was such a fun experience because you had all these very party line, politically reliable Russians, and all the foreigners were sort of wild, right? They were like the rebels, they were not the bureaucrats. And, I still have friends in Angola, and I had some Palestinians. 2 of my roommates were Palestinians, and Chile and Peru and Panama and all places like that. And that university produced presidents and ministers and in all kinds of different countries. So I think, and also some rebellious people as well. So those of us who didn't, drink the Kool-Aid, we came out of it with a broader perspective of the world, because it's like the United Nations. But at the same time, we were not buying, the party line at all, right? So if you know the name Alexei Navalny, the leader of the Russian opposition recently, and he died in prison. And there's a great book called I think it's called Alexei Navalny Patriot, I believe, or just Alexei Navalny. But he was an alumni of the Friendship University, just like I was. But also it produced some dictators, some pretty shady characters, so some spies. The lack of freedom was so self-evident, and people, like hundreds of millions of people, just make their peace with it and live within those parameters. And to me, that's what makes it so urgent for me to say, never, ever, never compromise essential freedom for a little safety. You don't get the freedom back. You have to fight for it. And because I saw the alternative, right? And I remember one of the biggest contrasts that really described the stark reality was East Berlin and West Berlin divided by a wall. So the backstory is that World War II came to an end, and Berlin, sort of the main city at the time, were divided between the Allies and zones of influence. So the Russians had full control of East Berlin, and they actually put the wall because people were fleeing from East Berlin to prosperous West Berlin, from an unfree place to a free place, which is sort of the way things work. We want freedom. So they built a wall, and they would shoot people that wanted to cross. You were forbidden. You could not. So there were families who were divided forever, right? And then the few that had the documents, the permission of the state to cross over, they could cross over. So the checkpoint Charlie, the famous place, was there. And I had privilege to have this dual citizenship, right? My mom couldn't cross because she was just a Soviet citizen. My cousin, who lived in Berlin, East Berlin citizenship, but not West Berlin, East Germany, she couldn't cross. But my sister and I, who had double citizenship as teenagers, would cross. So we would come in by train to see my cousin and would stay with her. And then they would give me some money, because that's how we made our living. The average salary in Moscow at the time was about $150 a month. That was the salary. So what we could do is we used the ability to cross over to the West to get some goods and then sell them back, multiple times price that we bought on the black market. That's how we made our living in Russia. And so we were sort of these amateur entrepreneurs. And so my sister and I would cross over. So one side of the same city, same culture, same people, same language, just a few decades separated one from the other. One living in freedom, the other one living in tyranny. East Berlin was this grayscale, black and white place, right? And it was the same people. And then you cross over and it's multicolor, Coca-Cola, all these shopping malls and music and merchandise and cars. And the car part was sort of fascinating to me because, these are the people that created the Mercedes-Benz and Audi and BMW and others. So these are the people that cornered the market. They were masters of creating cars. And just a few decades post-occupation of a tyrannical regime in Eastern Germany, all they could do is produce this atrocious car called the Trabant, which is like made of plastic or something. It was horrible. If you get the book, you'll see how it looks, or just Google it. The Trabant. And my cousin had a Trabant, and I actually drove in a Trabant, and it's like a death trap. Okay, it was just it's the worst car ever made, I think. And now, when the wall fell, hundreds of thousands of East Germans, they just abandoned them as trash. And eventually, it became a collectible. So it became sort of an exotic thing to collect, is to get those Trabants. But it's really a great visual of freedom versus tyranny. There's all kinds of rabbit holes I can go into talking about that and what went wrong and all of that. But when the Soviet Union fell apart in Russia, we had about 10 years of actual freedom. And in those 10 years, a lot of really dramatic things happened, including some messy things, because if you imagine a fully integrated system that's planned from top down, centrally planned society, and it all falls apart. There's poverty, there's crime, there's all kinds of things that happened there. Tanks in the streets. There was an attempted coup at some point. But also, what happened is, if they had just given it a chance beyond just the 10 years of freedom Russia had, literally in its whole history, I think it would have been a great experiment, and definitely a possibility for freedom long-term in Russia, which of course they didn't give it that chance. And it all reverted to now an autocratic regime. And it really saddens me that that's what happened, and that's going to continue to happen over there. One of the things about tyranny is, look, every once in a while you'll get a benevolent dictator that will turn things around. And there are cases in history where that happened. Most of the times, not. In the history of Russia, a lot of the times it was not, right? Especially in the last 100 years or so. My grandfather, his name is Lavrentiy Levchenko. He was a farmer in Ukraine, and I'm a quarter Ukrainian, a quarter Russian. So interesting perspective on the war that's happening right now. And the Bolsheviks basically did this. They decided that they need to collectivize the farmers, and they just put them in a sort of an industrial model. You put them together, shared farms, and there's no private property. Of course, farmers do not like when people take their land, take the fruit of their labor. I mean, it's just a particularly attached group of people to specific property, and there's pride in it, and there's industry in it and everything. And what they did is, if they saw you as somebody who had a little bit more than everybody else, meaning you're not oppressed, so you're now the oppressor, and they call these farmers who had maybe a slightly bigger house, maybe an extra cow, maybe they had one or two guys working for them or something. They would call them kulaks, which is basically in Russian for fist. And they would just destroy them. And they would expropriate all of their stuff in favor of the state. And they would either shoot them on the spot, they would take their harvest, or and the lucky ones, they were just moved to another place, exiled. And as a result of that collectivization, in just Ukraine, I think the estimates are, and there's no exact number, of about 6 million people literally starved to death in one of the most fertile places on earth. They starved to death. And my great-grandfather was there. And he was one of the lucky ones who didn't get killed and starved to death, but he was exiled to Siberia, somewhere on the border with China, in the middle of nowhere. And what I love about that story is, and we'll sort of touch upon it in the chapter about entrepreneurship, is that, years later, the war came, World War II. And my mom and her two sisters, her mom, so this single mom, my grandfather was on the front lines fighting in the war. They were evacuated, and they were evacuated from a little city close to Moscow called Novomoskovsk. And the last train that left, that was the last train, and they didn't have fancy train cars. It was just a flat train car, and they just piled people on, and they took them out because the Nazis were bombing. So they were literally evacuated. My mom was a baby, and the Nazi bombers were bombing that train, and they would stop, they would detach the main engine, and they would just wait out and then collect the bodies or bury the bodies, and then attach the train and keep going. And eventually they made it into Siberia, and there were massive food shortages. It was actual hunger. And they eventually joined my great-grandfather, who was exiled there. And of course, the story that I love to tell is that if you're an entrepreneurial person, they can take all of what you have, everything except for your life, and you will build something again. And that's what he had. He had, a couple of cows, I think, some pigs, some chickens, and things like that. And he had a house. And the whole family, the extended family, I think it was maybe 20, 25 people. He fed them through the remainder of the war, where other people were experiencing hunger, because he was just that kind of person. And to me, I love telling that story to remind that liberty is a precious thing, and it can be taken from us. And if it can be taken from us at scale, the most industrious, the most creative people, the most hardworking people, they will be maligned, they will be badmouthed. What they do is characterized as evil just because they know how to build stuff. And I think we should stay away from that kind of ideology, as it's already here in America, actually. And freedom can be extinct in one generation if unfree cultural traits propagate, and if people do accept a reduction of their essential liberties in exchange for what is called temporary safety or or called protection or called fairness or provision by the government. I have very strong feelings against it because just I know the underlying mechanism, the thing under it, although it's sort of shown as something noble and beneficial, it ends up in really bad places. So I think for us as Americans, it's a good idea to sort of be very aware of everything from a macro to a micro level. If an institution, an organization, if a government, even if a person in your life restricts your freedom to make choices, I think it's a good idea to resist and to very much push back and question it and retain that ability to make choices, to have freedom, to be inspired to do things and build things. And I hope this mosaic of stories can help you be aware of it, be grateful that you live in an amazing country, and to fight for your freedoms, protect them, and nurture a culture, a unique culture here in the United States where freedom is like, it's everywhere. It's like air, right? And I hope we keep it that way. Thank you.